Thanks to Helen for organizing such a great workshop. I learned a lot, and I look forward to the discussion. As you know from previous sessions, if you didn't know before, in war, cultural artifacts and works of art are often destroyed or looted. And when this happens, presumably a duty to return these items or pay compensation for the destruction is triggered. And the question I'm interested in here is, who should we return these items to, or who should we pay compensation to when these items are destroyed? And so now the answer might seem straightforward. So if there's an aggressive country, like let's call it A, and A has looted certain works of art or has destroyed certain works of art from another country, the victim country, call it V, then A should return this work of art to V, or should pay compensation to V for these for destroying these works of art. There was a lack of justification for destroying. So this is a very simple explanation of what should happen. Now, even if we work with this very simple model, things are far from straightforward. There are lots of complicated questions. Can you ever fully compensate the destruction of a unique work of art? And then depending on how destructive the war was, how should we prioritize? How should we prioritize, say, compensating for the destruction of works of art vis-a-vis doing other things, building hospitals and schools and things like that. Now, these questions have received some attention in the debate. There's a further complication that, as far as I know, has been neglected so far, at least in the philosophical debate. And the complication is this. Millions of works of art and cultural artifacts that are currently hosted in museums and other sites around the world have been acquired through unjust means. So going back to my simple case, V possesses these items, but it's not clear that V has a right to them, because these items were previously, say, stolen from other countries or looted, so on and so forth. And so other countries might have a claim for repatriation of these cultural artifacts. So famous examples include the Greece repatriation claim for the Parthenon marbles, currently kept in the British museums, the Nigeria's repatriation claim for the Benin bronzes, the claims for the return of Native American items. So I think that this complicates things considerably, because if this claim over these works of art and these cultural artifacts is tainted by an history of injustice, and it's because of this history of injustice that the work of art ended up in this possession, then is it still the case that V is entitled to having these works of art returned to V? Or should A return these works of art to somebody else? Or should, in case these works of art are destroyed, should someone else be compensated for the destruction of these items and these works of art? So this is the question I'm interested in considering here. These are really early thoughts. This is not something I've really thought about before I was invited to present here. So I'm really curious to hear what people who know more than me about this, namely everyone in this room, has to say about this. So there are two claims that I want to defend in this paper. One is a claim about the grounds for repatriation, and so this is here we are not considering the issue of war yet. So a couple of justifications for repatriations have already emerged in the discussion yesterday. One has to do with property rights. So we can identify who has a claim over a certain work of art or over certain cultural artifacts simply by pointing at the fact that someone has acquired legitimately this work of art, and so it's the owner of this work of art. But there's a second claim that has to do not with property rights, but it has to do with the fact that, say, a certain group has a particular investment in an item because that item plays an important role in the religious, cultural, political life of a group. And so these claims need to be kept separate, but they both seem to me plausible grounds for justifying claims for repatriation over works of art that have been removed from their legitimate owners or from those who have a particular claim over them. Now, again, lots of complications here. There are two main kinds of complications. There is a metaphysical question here of whether the existing group that now issues a claim for repatriation is really the same group from which the item was originally stolen. So someone could say, look at the Greek political community today. Is it really the same group from which the Parthenon marbles were stolen 200 years ago? And philosophers will disagree. And then there are epistemic problems here, namely whether a certain item was indeed acquired in an unjust way. Was it stolen? Was it sold? Was it sold under coercion? Was there some sort of manipulation? And so some cases are very clear, some cases are less clear. But it seems to me that these questions have been discussed, and you can come up with. I'm sympathetic to both claims. I think you can come up with good explanations for why both claims are justified. What I want to do here is to look at the third justification for repatriation claims that, as far as I know, has not been discussed yet. And the question that I'm interested in is how the duty to repatriate stolen works of art is affected not by how we should respond to the fact that someone else has a claim over that work of art based on property rights or based on cultural significance or things like that. But how the question of repatriation is affected by how we should respond to the fact that work of art is valuable for its own sake. So philosophers use the label final value. Something is valuable for its own sake if it has final value. It's not valuable simply because of what it does for others. It's not valuable simply because, for example, we enjoy the work of art or we derive pleasure from looking at the work of art. So instead of looking at the discussion so far on repatriation as focused on justifying claims that some people have over certain items, and I want to instead look at how we can justify repatriation claims by looking at the question of how we should respond to the final value of art. So plausibly, how we should treat art and works of art in particular is determined not only by the claims that groups or individuals have over these items, but also by their final value. So for example, suppose that someone was, this came up yesterday when I brought up this example of the Da Vinci manuscript that Bill Gates bought. Now suppose that anyone who has a claim over this manuscript or anyone who has a claim over a Picasso painting is happy to have the painting destroyed. So now we can imagine that you identify, maybe you think that all humanity has a claim over a Picasso painting, but suppose that the whole of humanity consent to the destruction of the painting. And so nobody would be wrong if the painting is destroyed. There is no one who has a claim over the painting who would be wrong by the destruction of the painting, but intuitively, it would be wrong to destroy the painting. And that's because the painting is valuable independently of the claims that other people have over the painting. So the claims that are related to property and that are related to the cultural value of certain works of art, do place constraints on how we can permissibly treat the work of art, but so does the fact that the work of art is valuable for its own sake. Okay, so let me clarify this thought that work of art has final value, and so let me be a bit more precise about how this notion operates. So there are two ways in which something can have final value, something can be valuable for its own sake. Probably the most obvious one and the most famous one is this notion of intrinsic value. On the way in which I understand this notion, something has intrinsic value when it possesses value in virtue of certain internal features. So a Caravaggio painting has intrinsic value in virtue of the fact that it has certain properties, certain formal properties. The color is, it has a certain color, the light is used in a certain way, the proportion of the figures are such and such. But then there's a second component to final value, which has to do not with the intrinsic value, but with extrinsic value. It has to do not with the internal features of the work of art, but with its relational property. So some ways in which the Caravaggio is valuable for its own sake have to do with the fact that, for example, it's a unique painting, or Caravaggios are rare, or it has it's innovative in the way in which Caravaggio uses light, or it has historical value. These are features that don't have to do with the internal properties of the Caravaggio, but they have to do with how the Caravaggio relates to other things in the world. Right? If someone else before Caravaggio had used the light in the same way, the Caravaggio wouldn't have the value that it has in virtue of the fact that no one before Caravaggio used the light in that way. If there was a Caravaggio in every corner of the street, then we might think that the intrinsic value of the Caravaggio would diminish accordingly. So, now, here's my suggestion. I think that there are two relational properties that affect the final value of works of art. One is this: the fact that a work of art is exhibited in a context that perpetuates the injustice committed when the work of art was illegitimately acquired negatively affects the value of the work of art. So, the context where the work of art is presented negatively affects the value of the work of art if the context where it is presented perpetuates the injustice that had to do with that was committed when the work of art was stolen or when it was looted. So, if museums fail to return Native American artifacts to their legitimate owners, in exhibiting these items, museums intentionally perpetuates the injustice that was committed against the Native Americans. And this, I think, this diminishes the value of the final value of the work of art. And similarly, the fact that a work of art has a history of injustice, where, say, it was stolen as part of a colonial process, and this history of injustice hasn't been addressed, that also, I will try to argue, diminishes the value of the final value of the work of art. So the correct way to respond to the value of the work of art is to make sure that they are not exhibited in a context that perpetuates the injustice committed when the works of art were looted or stolen, and that we address the history of injustice of the work of art. So the first claim I make is about the context of where the work of art is exhibited and experienced by the public, and the second claim has to do with the history of the injustice of the work of art. Now, I'm more confident about the first claim than I am about the second, but they both seem plausible to me. So what follows? Suppose that these two claims are correct. Suppose I persuade you of that. Then what follows from that? So if it is true that the final value of a work of art is negatively affected by the fact that it exhibited in a context that perpetuates the injustice perpetrated when it was illegitimately acquired, and by the fact that there is a history of injustice that remains unaddressed, then one way to respond to the final value of the work of art is to return it to those who have a claim to it. Doing this would be a way of restoring the loss in value generated by the fact that it's exhibited in the wrong context or that it has such a history. Okay, so here's one way in which I think obviously we might be tempted to resist this view. The objection is this: look, the value of the work of art is simply the value of the experience that is afforded to us by the work of art. So it's the value, it has to do with the internal states of affairs that are produced by us experiencing the work of art. And these internal states of affairs are not affected by the context or the history. So you see the Caravaggio, you enjoy the Caravaggio, and that's all there is to it. And perhaps someone could concede that if you know that there is a history of injustice connected to the Caravaggio, that perhaps makes it less pleasant for you to look at the Caravaggio. That kind of spoils the fun, if you like. But not everybody will be aware, for example, that there's a history of injustice there. And so their fun will not be spoiled. So now, unless you think that the value of the final value of the work of art changes from person to person, then you should conclude that the value of the work of art is not affected by the injustice. But it seems clear to me that the value of a work of art cannot be reduced to the value of the experience afforded to us by the work of art. So a perfect copy of a Caravaggio might afford the same experience as the original, certainly to me, and I'm sure to most people, except apart from a few experts. And yet, we normally think that the value of the original is far superior than the value of a copy. And one way to explain this is to point out that the original has a particular history that goes back directly to the artist in a way in which the copy doesn't. This seems to suggest that the history of the work of art affects the final value of the work of art. But if so, why not think that the other historical properties of the work of art, for example, the fact that it is part of a history of injustice, also affect the value of the work of art? Now, I say this to stress that my claim is a ontological claim, a metaphysical claim about the value of the work of art. I'm not making a claim about our experience when we enjoy the work of art. But it's also not my intention to underestimate the importance of how we experience the work of art. In fact, I believe that thinking about this question, the question of how we experience the work of art, also affects the metaphysical question of the value of the work of art. So there's a broader issue here, which is, how do we identify the relevant features of the work of art? Are they simply the features that the artist put into the work of art? And that seems implausible. The aesthetic experience is the result of how we mentally engage with the work of art. But if so, then it seems plausible that our perspective in experiencing the work of art, the perspective of the person enjoying the work of art, also matters in determining the value of the aesthetic experience. But our experience is, of course, affected by the context where we experience the work of art, the context where the work of art is exhibited, and possibly also by its history. And again, here I don't mean experience purely in subjective terms, right? So again, the idea that in admiring the Native American artifacts, it bothers me that they were taken away through coercion or manipulation, but also in objective terms, right? So whether I think about it or not, in visiting a collection that includes stolen works of art, I am taking part in a practice that is exploitative in nature and that is tainted by this history of wrongdoing. So my aesthetic experience is compromised whether I realize it or not if the work of art in question is exposed in a museum that, in presenting this work, perpetuates the injustice that was committed when the work of art was unjustly acquired. This is one thought. So let me offer you a second argument which is related but separate from this one. And here's another way of looking at it. So some believe that the aesthetic value of works of art is affected by the moral content of the work of art. No matter how significant the formal virtues of a painting or a book are, if the moral content of the work of art is bad, then that reduces the aesthetic value of the work of art. So some people think, for example, that the value of Renoir's portraits is diminished by their sentimentality, or the value of some of Ezra Pound's poems is diminished by their anti-Semitism. Now, this position is controversial, of course, but suppose it is true for now that the aesthetic value of a work of art is affected by its moral content. So why not think that the moral context also affects the aesthetic value? So here's why I think we should think that. How is it that the moral content of a work of art can affect its aesthetic value? It seems the most plausible idea is that this is because of the attitudes that are displayed by the artist in producing the work of art. Right? So it's the fact that in producing the work of art, say the artist was trying to further the domination of a minority, or even simply express disdain for a particular group. But then if the attitudes of the artist affect the aesthetic value of the work of art, why not think that the attitudes of the people making the work of art available to the public also matter in the same way, and so also reduce the value of the work of art, right? So think about what it takes. So the artist has this plan. The artist wants to produce this work of art that will further the subjection of a group, or that will express disdain for a group. And so what the artist can do is to produce a painting or a book. But that's not going to get the artist to realize his plan. He needs, or she needs, someone to take the project forward and make the work of art available to others. A publisher, a curator, someone like that. And so it's a two-step process. And why would it be that only the attitudes that are connected to the first step reduce the value of the work of art, and not the attitudes that are connected to the second step, since both steps are necessary to realize this evil plan? Now, suppose, so this argument was premised on the idea that the aesthetic value depends on the moral content of the work of art. Now, suppose you don't believe that. Not everybody accepts that view. Seems to me that even so, my argument goes through once we focus not on the aesthetic value, but on the value of the object per se. So the value of an object is not reducible to its aesthetic value. Even the value of a Caravaggio is not reducible to the aesthetic value of the Caravaggio. Perhaps the value of the Caravaggio is increased by the fact that, it's been in my family for a long time, or some other similar property. And a cheap painting, of course, might have value in virtue of the fact that it's been in my family for a long time. So in virtue of, again, non-intrinsic properties. A mundane object, a coin, a spoon, might have final value in virtue of its rarity or in virtue of its historic significance. So it looks as if the context might affect the value of an object even if it doesn't affect the aesthetic value of an object. So even if you don't accept the view that moral content affects aesthetic value, I think there's still good reason to accept the view that the context and relational properties that are connected to the context will affect the value of a work of art, although they might not affect its aesthetic value. Okay, so here's one final argument for this claim very, very briefly. Some believe that the value of art consists, among other things, in fostering our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of the world. So according to this view, art is a source of moral knowledge. Again, not everybody accepts this view. Plato famously rejected it. Aristotle defended it. My understanding is that many do. Derek will know this better than me. So suppose it is true. Then it seems to me plausible that the context where we experience the work of art also affects our understanding of the world. So if the work of art is experienced in a museum, that perpetuates the idea that the effects of colonial domination need not be redressed. It's okay to go and admire these artifacts, Native American artifacts in a museum. That affects our understanding of how serious the wrong of colonialism and how serious, and what counts as an appropriate response to such wrong. How serious the wrong of colonialism is and what counts as an appropriate response to such wrong. So here's the nice thing of, suppose all or some of these arguments are persuasive. Here's a nice feature of this argument. That this argument, if it works, it can justify a duty to repatriate works of art, even if we cannot satisfactorily answer the metaphysical question. Even if we cannot establish that this painting or the Parthenon marbles or whatever were stolen from a group that is identical, that is the same group as the one that today is claiming that this item should be returned. Even if we can't do that, we might still have a duty to repatriate the work of art in virtue of the fact that it's not because that we can establish the identity between the existing group and a past group matters only if we're trying to respond to a claim that the group has. Right? Now we want to make sure that the claim that this group today is advancing is well-founded because the group in question is the same group from which the object was stolen in the past. But if these arguments are plausible, we don't care about that because it's about responding to the value of the work of art. So the problem is that insofar as the work of art is exhibited in a context that perpetuates the injustice, or insofar as the history of injustice remains unaddressed, then we are not able to respond to the final value of the work of art. And so we need to remove the work of art from the context of injustice. And in doing that, we don't need to know anything about anyone else's claim. Now, of course, it might be hard to identify a group that has a claim to the work of art, but it's easy to identify the group whose use of the work of art is negatively affecting the value of the work of art. That's the group that has stolen the work of art that currently has the work of art. So remove it from there would be the solution. But then now we have the question, then how can we identify who should host the work of art? And here I think that if principles of restorative justice cannot help, say because we cannot answer the metaphysical question or the epistemological question, I think we can look at principles of distributive justice. So perhaps we should remove Native American artifacts from American museums, and we should give them to a group, a country that is the country that is best able to look after them, or the country that will make it easier for most people to experience these artifacts. Again, assuming that we cannot identify the group that has a claim. So in this case, in the case of the Native American artifacts, it should be easier to identify the claim. So imagine a case where it's not easy. So here are two principles. The group who's best able to look after the work of art, or the group that will make it easier for others to experience the work of art. We might not like these principles either, because we'll think that they'll favor countries that already have a significant reserve of works of art and cultural artifacts. There are other candidates, so it could be relocated to the group that lacks significant works of art and cultural artifacts, or the group that will make it easier for people from countries disadvantaged in terms of presence of work of arts and cultural artifacts. So you have an explanation of why the guilty party has a duty to repatriate the work of art, and then you have a separate question of how you establish where the work of art should go if you cannot establish who has a claim to the work of art. Okay, so far I've presented this view about what grounds the duty to repatriate works of art, a view which I think supplements the traditional answers offered to this question in the debate. So now I move to the question of who should receive these works of art, and who should receive compensation when they are destroyed in war. So I go back to the case that I presented at the beginning of this talk. So remember, there's country A loots or destroys work of art in country B, but B did not have a right to this work of art because B had originally stolen or looted those works of art elsewhere. So suppose that V stole these works of art from another country, C. Now, A has the work of art. Who should A return the work of art to? Should it give it back to B or not? It seems to me, I'm intrigued by the idea that even if A stole the work of art from B, A should return the work of art to C, namely the country from which the work of art was originally stolen. It's true that A stole the work of art from V, but V had no title over the work of art, so I don't see why there would be any reason to return the work of art to V. So suppose that someone steals the Parthenon marble, it'd be hard to do, but suppose that someone steals it from the British Museum, it's not clear why they should be returned to the British Museum. In fact, it seems to me that the British Museum and Britain were never wrong would not be wrong if the marbles were stolen from the British Museum, and that if whoever steals the Parthenon marbles from the British museums returns them to Britain, this would be a way of perpetuating the injustice suffered by Greece, if Greece indeed has a claim over the marbles. So the only way in which A can stop being a wrongdoer in the example I gave is by returning the work of art to C rather than to B. Now, if adopted, this proposal would have significant implications, it seems to me, because as we know, there is a vast amount of works of art that have been unjustly acquired by museums and other cultural institutions around the world. So, there might be situations where say it might be impermissible for C to try and recover stolen works of art from B by waging war or even simply imposing sanctions, because that would be disproportionate. But now C wouldn't have to do that. A has the work of art and could return it to C instead of returning it to B. So I think there are two questions, two worries that can be raised against this argument. There is a principal objection and there is a pragmatic objection. So the principal objection is this. We might worry that A lacks the standing to decide to return the work of art to C rather than to V. But the question of standing normally speaks to the issue of blame and the issue of who has the right to call others to account. So it is argued, I think, persuasively, that if we are ourselves responsible for certain wrongdoing, then we cannot blame others for the same wrong that we are responsible for. We lack the standing for doing that. But none of this is at stake here. Here, what's at stake is not blaming anyone, it's not calling anyone to answer. The matter at stake here is simply who should be made whole. And it seems that no special standing is required for that. Right? So perhaps I cannot blame you for being a thief if I'm a thief myself, but if you steal someone else's bike, it seems plausible to me that I can return the bike to the legitimate owner. Anyone can return the bike to the legitimate owner. So the only way in this case where my standing might be undermined is if there are some institutions that have been assigned the right to operate in this way, but we currently lack such institutions. And so this is where the pragmatic question, this connects to a pragmatic question. So we might worry that A might suffer all sorts of biases in deciding who the work of art in question should be returned to. And perhaps a third party ought to be in charge of deciding whether the work of art should go to V or to C. But it's hard to imagine a suitable third party that could be involved and that is not biased. The UN doesn't seem a promising choice given the disproportionate influence that some countries have over it. But in principle, I would be happy with the idea of having an institution that is created to impartially adjudicate conflicts of this sort. So what I'm interested here is just to highlight the underlying moral principles. So I think I'll stop here. The takeaway point is, there's a staggering number of works of art that have been unjustly acquired by museums and other institutions around the world. I've suggested first that there are powerful duties to repatriate these items for reasons that haven't been discussed in the literature yet, at least as far as I know. And that when these items are looted or are from their current holders or they are destroyed, they should not be returned to their current holders, or compensation should not be paid to the current holders when the current holders are themselves responsible for having stolen or for having stolen those items in the past.
Massimo, thank you very much. So once we've got a kind of relational model of final value, different things can kind of drift in to the account of final value. So I don't think I have any decisive objections to your proposals, but I'm kind of resistant to them. I mean, for one thing, so just a couple of points. So you make the point that, well, the value of a Caravaggio painting will probably depend on, say, how innovative he is. That's extrinsic because we'd need to know who else was doing what at the time. That's true. And so once we admit that kind of form of extrinsic value, why not admit further forms such as the injustice of the of an original theft of it? But I think and this isn't to repudiate your suggestion, but it's to put these things in different categories. I mean, so one list of features helps us to interpret it as a work of art. So I think the qua move works there. Qua work of art. We situate this painting in a certain lineage of paintings. If we were writing a history book, we'd need to know, well, where does Caravaggio fit in? Well, he did this first, and he did that first, and he was an innovator here and there. So yeah, all that stuff seems to matter to our evaluation of it as a work of art. And then, but the further stuff about the background circumstances of injustice, theft, turnover of ownership, they don't seem to have the same kind of implications for what we'd say about it qua work of art. So I think there's a difference. And second, I think your view has the following implication. If A has stolen a very valuable work from V, and V is aggrieved, then V's complaint is tempered, or should be tempered, by the fact that the work of art has lost value, precisely in virtue of its being stolen by A. So I really love this work of art. It was a fantastic work of art, and then A's defense says, yes, but now that A's stolen it, it's a less valuable work of art. So, you have some complaint, but you have less complaint, simply because by your own rights, the value of the work of art has declined. But that looks like the wrong implication. That looks bad, I think.
Good, thanks. These are helpful. So I think I can address the second point quickly. So it seems that the complaint could still be, well, if V were to, or whatever, if C were to get the work of art returned, then that would be the right way of responding to the final value of the work of art. And so that would restore the work of art. So if C were to get the work of art returned, the work of art would get its original final value. So the fact that while it is in V's possession, the work of art has less value, that's not a problem for C, because C says, give it back to me. Once I have it back, it'll have back its original value.
Yeah, that's true. I grant you that. But I still think the case... So I just have a simpler model in mind. A nicks from V, V wants it back. I mean, we can talk about C if you want. But so I think intuitively... A's complaint is going to be supported by the fact that something of supremely high value has been taken. V is going to complain that something of extremely high value has been taken by A. Now your workaround is, well, it may have less value now, but once we have it back in our possession, it'll have supreme value. But it looks like a different kind of complaint. It's like, we want something that will be valuable. The complaint is we want something back of high value. That's because that helps to characterize the badness of the theft. If the fact of the theft automatically means that the value of the work declines, then I think that just has kind of troublesome implications for what we want to say about the injustice, as well as having unacceptable implications for what we want to say about the value of the work of art.
No, so I disagree with that. So it seems to me that how much I'm harmed by the theft depends on what I lose, not on what you gain. So it might be that while I don't have it, you don't benefit from it as much. You can make the same argument about instrumental value, right? So perhaps you steal something from me that I can use better, so I benefit more from having this machine than you having this machine. It seems that if we were to quantify the loss that I suffer, we would that would have to be indexed to, well, what I lose, not on what you gain. And what I lose is what I can get out of it, not what you can get out of it. And I think we can offer a similar argument for final value. On the first point, that's interesting. So you said it doesn't tell us something about the value of the work of art. I have to think more about this. So your point was, if you look at how innovative a certain work is, that tells us something about the work of art. But being exposed in a context of injustice doesn't tell us something about its value qua work of art. So, am I right that this objection is based on rejecting two of the arguments that I've offered? So the argument that has to do with moral content and moral context.
I think it's separate from the immoralism debate because there might be, Derek will know much more about this than me, but I think it depends on how the work of art is imbued with certain moral qualities. Easier to detect in literature, presumably, than painting. It's not quite clear how a painting can be itself immoral. It simply depicts a scene, right? Or a realist painting depicts a scene, so it's not quite clear what moral story you're going to pour into it, right? A bit easier literature, I think, I don't know.
Yeah. Thanks, though. I have to think, so, yeah.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with this convention.
Oh, this means, sorry. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that, Massimo. It's quite interesting. There were certain aspects I have to admit I kind of flew by me just because my mind, I'm an anthropologist, so I kind of see things a little differently. It is, did I not? Yeah, it is on. So, just a couple of things. When it comes to issues of ownership, and I think Christina will very likely also elaborate more. She's a museum curator, so that's her bailiwick, and she can talk more about that. But I think we do have some conventions about how we define ownership from the curatorial museum context. And one way of addressing some of the kind of issues that you are raising is the idea of ownership on behalf of. So yes, a valuable painting like Picasso or whatever, you can actually have physical, material on that, you purchased it, but you also, there comes with the understanding that you are owning this on behalf of a much wider audience, and you are really a curator. And many owners of high-end pieces of art see themselves as curators rather than owners. Or I can, I'd like you buy any house and then you pay $10 million for it just to bulldoze it because you want a better view. And it has happened. You can't do this where you buy, two Picassos and destroy one to make the other Picasso more rare. There is that element here. And in fact, it brings in the whole idea of ownership in trust. And these are mechanisms that museums do where there is this kind of, contestation or something, you're contesting ownership. So between two countries, and a country might say, okay, as a kind of middle ground or some sort of compromise, we're the original owners and you are holding it in trust for the next 99 years, or they're convinced. The other question very quickly, you said valuable as a category, you said valuable for its own sake. I really did not understand that, because value, there is even an object with an intrinsic value. It is at the end of the day an assigned value. Gold is valuable because we decided it is valuable because of its rarity, or something is valuable for. So how, outside the fact that we assign a value to something based on some other basis, how can something be valuable for its own sake? Value is always assigned. So if you could perhaps give me an example of I would appreciate it. Thank you.
So I'm happy to answer. I was wondering if Christina's point is related to the first point. Oh, okay. So on the second thing, see, certain kind of values are conventional that way. So gold seems to be an example. We think that gold, we assign certain value to gold, and that is a conventional matter. Think about the value of nature, for example. The value of nature, the value of the Grand Canyon. It's not just that we tend to enjoy watching, admiring the Grand Canyon, and that's why the Grand Canyon is valuable. Think about the value of certain relationships. It's not just that we enjoy being in those relationships. Certain things seems to have value independently of what people, how much people actually value them. Does that help at all? No. Yeah. 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 So my view is that art is perhaps, you seem to think that art is closer to gold than the Grand Canyon, but I think it's closer to the Grand Canyon. So it seems to me that when a tyrannical regime says the literature is terrible and certain books are a waste of paper, and even if the regime kind of spread and everybody believed that, that wouldn't change the fact that I suspect we'll not come to an agreement to this. Yeah. Let's move on from this. And what you say about ownership, that seems right to me. So it seems to me that ownership and other sort of claims are not in conflict. So I'm in agreement with that.
Actually, I wanted to ask the same question as Amr about the value per se, but also with a reflection that if there were not a common understanding about certain values, there will no museums, no World Heritage, no these things. If there were no common understanding of certain value, but then from curator point of view, a value of an object, a piece of art, also ethnological museums, not only arts in the sense of fine arts, it is a complex issue. There is no value, it's value with big V is a composition of many values. And it's like for a human being. You are not a valuable person because you are nice or because you are clever or because you are a valuable person because you are a composition of several values. And I think when curators decide to consider valuable an object is because they also have all this knowledge about the object itself. Is that you can have a contextual value in the middle of a collection, for example. You can have a very ugly object, no material value at all, but it is the object that has provided the discovery of understanding of a certain collection. So this object, finally, it has a most important value in the collection. You can have a very, materially speaking, not important valuable object, but then it is also a reference for the symbolic value that the community give to him. So the issue of value in the heritage field, it is always considered as a complex issue. You don't consider only one value. It is always and you have probably certain values that are repeated all the time when you consider this issue. And then each context is different. Each context will add additional value that are more contextual to the different situation. And then it is strange because when you were speaking about the issue that if you exhibit an object that has been looted in a museum and so on, you say that the value of the object decrease. Is strange because my perception, I will say that the value increase. No possibility that decrease.
Why does it increase?
It increases because you put on this object the fact that it has this injustice. So for the same reason you say that decrease, the same reason I say it increase. For exactly the same reason. I mean, the fact that it is put in a position where it is suffering again, it has been looted, and then it has been exhibited in a place. People are looking at this object and in a context where, you give more suffering on this. So for me, it is increasing the value.
Give more suffering, you suggest. I didn't understand. Suffering.
The object.
Okay.
I mean, the fact that, so for me, and I can say I think I can speak for other people in the heritage field. It is not decreasing the value. It is increasing the value in the fact that so you have to take more care about this object. You are really to put more emphasis, more action, more, because the value of this object is increasing, and the fact that you have to do more in order to take this object out from this context and put it back in the context where it belongs.
Okay.
So it's, I don't know, but it is strange how you explain the same process, it will arrive at the opposite result for me.
Good. So I took your first point to be a way of reinforcing what I said. So I certainly didn't want to suggest that there's value is one thing. Like the whole argument is premised on this idea that there are several components to final value. Some components have to do with internal features. Some components have to do with external relationships. And you mentioned some of those relationships. So thanks. That seems to be something that supports what I say. On your second point, so you said that the same argument that leads to the conclusion that the value decreases also leads to the conclusion that the value increases. I mean, one of the arguments offered, for example, is this idea that the reason why the value decreases is that the curator, in exhibiting the work of art, displays attitudes that are connected with this goal of, say, subjecting a group or expressing disdain for a group. And that if we think that those attitudes negatively affect the work of art when they are displayed by the artist in producing the work of art, I would think that they also affect the value when they are displayed by the curator. Now, perhaps this argument is unconvincing, but it's not. I don't see how this argument could lead to the reverse conclusion.
I thought again about this. The only way I see the value decreasing is in the material value of the object and in the curator value. Only the value of a curator decreases for me, because if I am a curator, I will not do this. So as a colleague, I see a curator exhibiting an object that has been looted. For me, it is not the value of the object itself which decreases, but the value of the person who has done this. So the value of a curator decreases, and the value of the object increases. Because the value of the curator decreases. And eventually, the value of the material value of the object, because you cannot sell anymore, because it is, it has been looted. So when an object is looted, the material value of the object decreases. This, yes, but material
I'm happy to,
Let's take a figure from
yeah.
Sorry, just a quick thing. I think there might be some ambiguity or conflation going on here. So there's a question about whether we think that a curator might have more responsibility for an object because it's stolen. And that can be true. If I borrow your car, I should take more care of it because it's yours and not mine. I can be kind of reckless with my own things in a way that I can't be with yours. But it wouldn't mean your car's more valuable. It's just that I can have greater responsibility with respect to things that aren't mine. I mean, the idea that looting can make things more valuable seems kind of worrying because it seems it would give us good reason to loot loads of stuff, right? Because I make it more valuable, so what's the objection, right? And there could be reasons not to, but still it gives a kind of perverse incentive to say, well, you just make it even more valuable if you nick it. So I don't think you need to say that to say what you want to say about this kind of sense that as a curator you have greater kind of a strong, more stringent duty to care for it, because you mentioned at the end of your comment about wanting to give it back, and you see that you see yourself as the custodian. And I think it's generally true that when we have possession of other people's property, we have stronger duties to take care of it, especially when we've, in some sense, unjustly acquired it, right? We're not looking after it by consent, or we haven't asked to borrow it. We've just taken it, right, when it's been looted. Then we definitely have very stringent obligations to care for it. But it doesn't follow that the object is more valuable than other instances of similar objects, right? So it doesn't become the most valuable car in the world, right, because I've sort of promised to look after it.
Perhaps I'm not expressing the concept correctly, but it is not the material value or economic value I'm speaking.
No, I know that. I mean, the aesthetic, Massimo is not talking about those things either.
It is a more complex set, so we all the value together.
Yeah, I think...
Okay, what I'll do is I'll just take a quick finger, because we've got a big queue, very little time, so if we can keep it very brief. Fred.
I guess, I mean, from a curator's perspective, if you have two cups and one of them has to do it and one of them has to do it.
Fred, can you use the mic?
From there, they have the same, let's say, art value or come from the same data or not. But if you want to tell a story that kind of involves the narrative of looting and trafficking, for instance, one of those cups would have much more value for you as a curator, and could also have an economic value because it can be used to attract people into the exhibition and tell a story. So, I mean, but still, I mean, you have a business.
From a curator point of view, it will be really very perverse, and I mean that you attract people to an exhibit, to an object exhibited because it has been looted.
That's not what I'm saying. But as a curator, I mean, you still have a business to run. You need if no one comes and watches the exhibition, there's not a lot of. Okay, that's
Yeah, different, yeah.
Okay.
On this issue of value and there are many values. I'll focus on the aesthetic value. I'll focus on the aesthetic value, ignoring other artifacts. So Caravaggio's case, and or works of literature. There's no doubt that at least some people think, and maybe for good reason, that moral manifested attitudes affect the quality of a work of literature or work of art. Even a painting can have a moral attitude, can be sentimental, for example, can be, and therefore you can interpret certain paintings as also can be nationalistic as well, can promote certain shallow values. So, and that can be a criticism of the work as a work of art. Now, on the other hand, it can also something immoral enter into the history of the production of that. So child labor, slavery entered into. So the pyramids, we have this kind of way. They're being done at the expense of many lives in glorification of a king. Now, on the other hand, the stuff you're talking about, which is being looted, being exhibited in the wrong place, the kind of relationship with that, in that case, is less convincing as a way of affecting the value of the work of art, because it's not it's neither entering the production, even one accepts that to be more relevant, nor it is part of the manifested attitudes of the work itself. There is an injustice happened, but it's not the one that affects the work, because it's not, doesn't enter into its production, nor enters into the manifestation. Although one might, for example, go and see the pyramids, and part of the experience, aesthetic experience, is awareness that this has been done unjustly. You don't have to diminish the appreciation. You might also appreciate the work done being there, and this kind of mixture of the marvel of the product while being seen as done at the expense of others does not diminish its achievement. It makes it a complex experience in that sense, rather than a flat one of something nice being done. Because it has a historical component, not only an aesthetic one. But again, I don't see how the kind of being looted or not affects the. I mean, if Caravaggio stole his paint that he painted with, that wouldn't really, even if though it is part of the production of the painting, it will not affect by any measure the value of Caravaggio. So we have to really make the distinctions clear. Yes.
Good. This is interesting. So I thought a little bit about this. So on the stealing the painting, I don't know, but I thought about the pyramids, and I was thinking, is the fact that they were built on these terribly oppressive practice, doesn't that affect, like, suppose another civilization had built something as impressive as the pyramid, or exactly the same as the pyramids, but relying on nice labor conditions. There was no slavery, no torture involved. Would that affect the aesthetic value of these works of art? I'm not sure. I wouldn't exclude it right away, but I'm not sure, I must confess. But I've thought about this a little bit, and I'm curious to hear what people think if they have views. There's another point that you made, which I think is interesting, and I think I want to resist that point. And so start with a simple case, right? A simple case where I say, I'm gonna make this painting, or write this pamphlet, which is against Polish immigrants in the UK, and then Helen, we are in cahoots. We want to kind of fire up the Brexiteers who are having a hard time right now. So say, I'll write this book, and she said, well, I'll take care of publishing, making sure that people read it. Or I'll paint this, painting with all these Polish people with red eyes, kind of landing at Heathrow. And she said, well, make sure that it's all over the news. And then it seems to me that in this simplistic case, I know that some of the cases I discussed here are more complex, but let's start with this case. In this case, it seems clear to me that if my attitude in producing the painting affects the aesthetic value of the painting, it's clear to me that Ellen's attitude in displaying the painting affects the aesthetic value of the painting. In this case, I don't see a difference between the two. I'm not sure. Yeah.
It seems to me that, let's say that you take Edward Munch's Scream, and you use it as an expression of fear of immigrants. Now, it will not diminish the value of Edward Munch's painting, even though it's being used now as a way to say, oh, we're afraid of not existential acts. This is a cry for Europe against those immigrants. That would be equivalent to the looted item, because the item produced without any kind of immorality, and now you are using it in an immoral context. And that will not affect the value of Munch's painting. It will only condemn those who are using it for that purpose.
Yeah, good. So this is the more complex case I wanted to get to. So I've thought a little bit about this. What do you think? I'm not so sure, right? Because just consider a case where Munch's painting is effectively used to that effect, right? And so now Munch becomes the the voice of the anti-Polish community. And there's something, it seems to me that there's, Munch suffers wrong here, but there's this perverse mechanism where, the purposes for which his work has been conceived are hijacked by the propaganda. And it's, again, I start with the idea, if in the simple case the attitude of the curator can affect the value, then when I think about this more complex case, and you only have the attitude of the curators, you no longer have the attitudes of the artists. The attitudes of the artists are not bad. But the curator, in a sense, is doing something even worse. He is hijacking the work of art for her own purposes. I find it plausible. I think if we think of a case where the curator successfully does that, and now Munch really becomes a tool of injustice, because people are really, starting to hate Polish more, and they are committing crimes against Polish, and the Munch's painting is contributing to that. It's no longer clear to me that the overall value is not diminished. And again, it could be the aesthetic value, or it could be the value, the final value, but not the aesthetic one. Sorry, I should be quicker.
We'll take a few minutes of lunch, I'm sure. Helen, if we be very brief.
So yeah, very quick point on the intrinsic value stuff, and then on this question that Bashar raised. So I'm struggling a little bit, so I could kind of see the distinction you're after here with this intrinsic, extrinsic, but I'm struggling a bit to think of a value-laden intrinsic property in the aesthetic context. So imagine if we said something like, well, look, it's an intrinsic property of the Caravaggio that gives it value, that it's very skillful. But that seems like a comparative judgment, right? If we could all paint like Caravaggio, it wouldn't be valuable. So I was struggling a bit to think of, other than just mere descriptive things, like that's a nice blue, right? I mean, to get the kind of value-laden stuff, I was struggling a bit to think of one that wouldn't be relational. And then on this, so I wonder whether on this question, about the sort of whether displaying in a certain context is to perpetuate the injustice. I don't know if you want to put it like that. It seems more like something like a case. It's not perpetuating it's not more of a theft, right? It doesn't make it more of a theft, or even a worse theft, right? Yeah. It's more like benefiting from injustice, right? So you've got this kind of, when you've got the people who go to the gallery and they enjoy it, right? It's benefiting from injustice quite straightforwardly. But I thought there could also, then it does seem to be, it's going to matter what people's attitudes are, because we could imagine cases in which the context in which something is displayed is an upshot of injustice. So imagine that during Nazi Germany, some Jewish works of art are hidden in someone's attic, and on holy days, members of the community secretly go and view them in the attic. Now, the context in which they're viewed is an upshot of injustice, but it doesn't seem like that would sort of have the similar kind of implications about the moral value and so on. So I just thought that needed kind of tightening up, right, this notion of what the connection is to the original injustice, and it's only going to be some context, right, when it looks like people have got certain attitudes that we might think that this has a detrimental effect on the value of the object.
Good. So, okay, very briefly, on the intrinsic property, I thought that would be the straightforward case. I think this is the case where there doesn't seem to be much disagreement. So the fact, for example, that the sense of proportion is nice, and it matches a sense of proportion that is the perfect one. I don't remember what's it called. Yeah, forms or shape or something. So I don't know. That case seems to me easier to discuss than the extrinsic value case. On the second point, I think I need to I need to think more about what I want to say. I don't think I want to say it has to do. What I'm thinking is not benefiting from injustice along the lines you suggested. That might also contribute to the value. It's true that it's not more of a theft, but again, start with a simple case where we stole the Native Americans' items because we are a superior race, or we are better suited because, they are subhuman and they are not able to take care of them. And now here's something that we can do. We can continue to act as a superior race by taking care of those. And because if we left them with there, then they wouldn't know what to do with them. And so in a sense, we are prolonging the injustice. It's not that we are stealing them again. It's not that it's more of a theft, but if you think of the injustice, not just in terms of the act of stealing, but kind of this perpetrating this colonial domination, for example, then
then it seems very much tied to the specific attitude.
We've run by 5 minutes, and I'm sorry for Fred and William didn't get to ask questions. But
I'm happy to discuss over lunch. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.